He smirked as he moved his queen, already bored, already winning, a grandmaster playing a nobody for laughs. But then the clock ticked once, twice, and something shifted. Her fingers steady, her eyes calm, Emily Carter moved a single pawn. And suddenly the board felt different, unfamiliar, dangerous. Victor Hale leaned forward, smile fading, calculating, recalculating, the room growing quieter with every second. Then he stopped, hand hovering midair, frozen. No move, no escape. Just silence. Spreading like shock through the crowd, and in that moment, everyone realized he wasn't playing her. He was already trapped, and this was only the beginning. He thought he could humiliate her in front of everyone, but had no idea he had just stepped into a game he could not win. And 15 minutes later, Grandmaster Victor Hale would sit frozen at the board, unable to move, the ticking clock echoing louder than his own thoughts. But right now the room was still filled with quiet arrogance, the kind that comes from years of being untouchable, the kind that makes a man believe no one in the room could ever challenge him. The prestigious Midtown Chess Invitational gleamed under warm chandelier light, polished wooden boards aligned in perfect symmetry. The air thick with focus, reputation, and silent judgment. Every spectator dressed sharp, every player measured, precise, elite, and at the center of it all stood Victor Hale, 5-time national champion, his tailored navy suit crisp, his silver hair immaculate, his confidence absolute. People didn't just watch him play, they watched him dominate, they expected it, they admired it, and more importantly, they never questioned it, until she walked in. Emily Carter moved quietly through the hall, almost invisible against the polished elegance surrounding her, her simple gray cardigan, her worn leather bag, her calm, unreadable expression making her look more like a misplaced observer than someone who belonged among masters. A few heads turned, not with curiosity, but with quiet dismissal. She didn't fit the room, and in a place like this, that was enough to decide who you were. Victor noticed her too, just for a moment, his eyes scanning, assessing, categorizing, and within seconds, dismissing. To him she was just another amateur who wandered in to watch greatness, nothing more, nothing worth remembering, until a casual comment turned into something else. "We could use a little entertainment before the finals," Victor said lightly, his voice carrying just enough for the nearby crowd to hear. A few chuckles followed, subtle but sharp, and then his gaze returned to her, deliberate this time. "You," he added, pointing, with a faint smirk, "care to play a quick round?" The room shifted, attention snapping toward her, curiosity mixed with amusement, because everyone understood what this was. Not a match, not a challenge, just a spectacle, a grandmaster playing a nobody for fun. Emily paused, just for a second, her fingers tightening slightly around the strap of her bag, her eyes lifting to meet his, steady, calm, unreadable, the kind of silence that doesn't argue, doesn't defend, just observes. And that silence, though unnoticed by most, carried something Victor didn't recognize, something he didn't respect. "Not yet, come on," he added, leaning back casually. "It'll be quick, more laughter, louder this time." The room leaning into the moment, ready to be entertained, ready to watch her fail before she even sat down. And for a brief second, it looked like she might decline, like she might simply walk away and disappear back into the background where everyone assumed she belonged. But instead, she stepped forward, slow, measured, deliberate, each step soft against the marble floor, yet somehow louder than the ticking clocks surrounding them. The board waited, polished, untouched, the pieces perfectly aligned. A battlefield prepared for something no one in that room expected. Emily took her seat across from Victor Hale, placing her hands gently on the table, her posture straight, her gaze steady, and without a word, she nodded once. The room quieted just slightly. Not out of respect, but anticipation, because everyone believed they already knew how this would end. But what none of them could see, not yet, was that the moment she sat down, the game had already begun, and Victor Hale, for the first time in years, was no longer the one in control. The pieces were set, the clock was pressed, and for a brief moment the room held its breath. not because they expected anything remarkable, but because they were waiting for the inevitable. Victor Hale made the first move with effortless confidence, his hand moving without hesitation as he advanced his pawn 2 squares forward. A classic opening, safe, controlled, the kind of move that signaled experience without needing to prove it. A few spectators nodded subtly, already recognizing the familiar rhythm of a master at work. Emily Carter did not respond immediately. Her fingers rested lightly against the edge of the board, her eyes scanning every square with quiet precision, not rushed. Not intimidated, just present, and that pause, though only a few seconds long, drew the first flicker of impatience from Victor. He leaned back slightly, a faint smirk returning to his lips as if to say this was exactly what he expected. Hesitation, uncertainty, weakness. Take your time, he said casually, loud enough for those nearby to hear. A soft ripple of amusement followed, but Emily did not react to the tone. She simply moved, her pawns sliding forward with a gentle, controlled motion, no flourish, no hesitation, just a response that matched his own opening with quiet symmetry. Victor's eyes dropped briefly to the board, noting the move, standard, unremarkable, exactly what a beginner would do when trying to mirror a stronger player, predictable, safe, and in his mind, already defeated. He responded quickly, developing his knight, the game progressing with the smooth, almost rehearsed tempo of someone who had played thousands of matches, each move placed with confidence, each second reinforcing the narrative the room had already accepted. This would be over quickly. Emily continued at her own pace, never matching his speed, never rushing to keep up, each move deliberate, each piece placed as if it belonged exactly where it landed, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, something in the rhythm of the game began to shift, not enough for the casual observer to notice, but enough for Victor to feel, like a subtle tension beneath the surface of something that should have been simple. He narrowed his eyes slightly, leaning forward now instead of back, his attention sharpening as he studied the board more carefully. Her moves were still simple, still clean, but there was a structure forming. Something intentional, something that did not quite align with the passive play he had expected. "You play often?" he asked, his tone still light, but now carrying a trace of curiosity beneath the surface. Emily's gaze remained on the board as she answered, her voice calm and steady. "Sometimes, nothing more, no elaboration, no attempt to impress, just a single word that seemed to settle into the space between them." Victor let out a quiet breath, dismissing the feeling as overanalysis. He had seen this before, players who stumbled into a few decent moves before collapsing under pressure. He pressed forward, increasing the tempo, his pieces advancing with more aggression now, testing her, probing for mistakes, expecting the moment where she would falter, where the room would laugh again, where this brief curiosity would dissolve into confirmation of his superiority. But that moment did not come. Emily adjusted, her pieces responding not defensively, but precisely. Each move closing off space, redirecting pressure, guiding the flow of the game in ways that were subtle, almost invisible, yet undeniably effective. The quiet murmur in the room began to fade, replaced by something else, something closer to attention. Because the game was not ending, it was evolving, and Victor felt it now, not as a threat, not yet, but as a question he did not expect to be asking. His next move slowed, just slightly, his hand hovering for a fraction longer than before as he calculated variations that should have been unnecessary, his confidence still intact, but no longer effortless. Across from him, Emily remained unchanged, her posture steady, her expression neutral, her eyes focused not on him, not on the crowd, but on the board itself, as if the noise, the judgment, the expectations had never existed. And in that growing silence, the first cracks in Victor Hale's certainty began to form, small, almost invisible, but real enough that he could no longer ignore them. The ticking of the clock grew louder now, not because it had changed, but because the room had. The soft murmurs that once carried amusement had faded into a quiet tension that no one openly acknowledged. Yet everyone could feel. Victor Hale leaned closer to the board, his fingers no longer moving with effortless certainty, but hovering, pausing, recalculating lines that should have been obvious to him, positions he had mastered years ago now. Demanded attention, and that alone unsettled him, because this was not how his games went. Not against someone like her. Across from him, Emily Carter remained unchanged, her posture still, her breathing even. Her gaze steady as she studied the board with quiet intensity. She did not rush. She did not react to the growing tension. She simply waited, as if she understood something the rest of the room did not. Victor made his move, advancing his bishop to apply pressure, a calculated attempt to break her structure, to force a response that would reveal weakness, the kind of move that usually dictated the pace of the game. But Emily responded without hesitation, her knight sliding into position with a soft, controlled motion that neutralized his threat while opening a new line of play. Subtle, efficient, precise. Victor's eyes narrowed. That was not a beginner's instinct. That was not luck. That was awareness. Deep awareness, the kind built over years. He leaned back slightly, masking the shift in his focus with a practiced calm, but inside, something was changing. The game was no longer a performance, it was becoming a problem, and problems required respect. The audience noticed it too, not in words, but in silence. The earlier smirks had disappeared, replaced by attentive stillness. A few seasoned players in the crowd exchanged glances, subtle, almost imperceptible, but meaningful, because they could see what others could not, the pattern forming beneath the surface. Emily was not reacting to Victor's moves, she was guiding them, shaping the board in a way that limited his options without appearing aggressive. It was quiet control, the most dangerous kind. Victor adjusted his next move more cautious, reinforcing his position instead of pressing forward, a shift that did not go unnoticed, because for the first time, he was not dictating the game, he was responding to it. Interesting, he murmured under his breath. More to himself than to her. Emily did not look up, she simply moved again, her pawn advancing one square, a small move, almost insignificant at first glance, but it carried weight. It closed a space Victor had been considering, redirecting his plan before it could fully form, and that was when he felt it clearly, the subtle tightening in his chest, not fear, not yet, but something close to it, uncertainty. He paused longer now, his hand resting against the table as he studied the board, calculating deeper, searching for the line that would restore his control, but every variation seemed to lead to the same place, limitation, constraint, quiet pressure building without a clear source. The room had gone completely still, the kind of silence that settles when something unexpected begins to unfold. Even those who did not understand the game could sense the shift, because Victor Hale was thinking, really thinking, not performing, not showcasing, but searching, and that alone was enough to change the atmosphere. Across from him, Emily finally lifted her eyes, not to challenge, not to provoke, but simply to observe, her expression unchanged, calm, almost distant, as if the outcome was already known to her, and in that brief moment of eye contact, Victor felt something he had not felt in years at a chessboard, not intimidation, but recognition, the quiet realization that he had misjudged the situation entirely, that the person sitting across from him was not a distraction, not a joke, but something far more complex, far more dangerous to his certainty. He broke the gaze quickly, returning his focus to the board, his next move slower than any before, placed with care, with caution, with the awareness that every decision now carried weight, and as the clock ticked on, louder, sharper, marking each second with growing intensity, the balance of the game continued to shift, not in sudden moves, not in dramatic captures, but in something far more unsettling, control, quiet, precise, undeniable control, and for the first time in that room, Victor Hale was no longer playing to win. He was playing to understand how he was already beginning to lose. Victor's fingers hovered above the board longer than ever before. The confidence that once defined his every movement now replaced by something far less comfortable. Calculation without certainty, the kind that demanded patience he was not used to showing in front of an audience. The ticking clock pressed against his focus, each second stretching just a little further than it should. His bishop shifted at last, a careful move, not aggressive, not dominant, but defensive, and that alone sent a quiet ripple through the few seasoned players watching. Because they understood what it meant when a man like Victor Hale began to protect instead of command. Emily Carter responded almost instantly, her rook sliding into alignment with a precision that felt almost inevitable, as if the position had been building toward that exact square all along. There was no hesitation, no flourish, just quiet execution. Victor leaned forward, his eyes scanning the board more intensely now, tracing lines, testing variations. But every path he explored seemed to narrow, not expand. Options that should have opened were closing, angles that should have pressured were dissolving into neutral ground, and beneath it all, something deeper was becoming clear. He was no longer ahead, he was being guided. The realization did not arrive suddenly. It crept in, subtle and unwelcome, like a shadow growing longer without notice. "You studied this line," he said quietly, his voice lower now, stripped of the earlier amusement. Emily did not answer right away. Her gaze remained on the board, her fingers lightly resting near her queen, and when she finally spoke, it was calm, almost distant. "I studied many lines, that was all. No pride, no explanation. Just a statement that settled into the silence between them." Victor exhaled slowly, his posture shifting again, the casual ease gone, replaced by a sharper, more controlled stillness, the kind he reserved for serious matches. But this was not supposed to be one, and that contradiction pressed against him, because the room felt it too. The shift was no longer subtle, it was undeniable. The earlier smirks had vanished completely, replaced by focused attention. Even those who did not fully understand the depth of the game could sense that something was unfolding beyond expectation. Victor reached for his knight, then stopped, his hand hovering midair as he recalculated. A small pause, but in a room like this, it echoed louder than any spoken word. He adjusted, choosing a different move, repositioning his queen to maintain pressure, but it felt reactive, not commanding, and Emily answered immediately, her bishop cutting across the board with quiet authority, aligning with her rook, reinforcing a structure that now looked less like defense and more like intention. Victor's jaw tightened slightly, not visibly to most, but enough that those closest to the board noticed, because this was not how a demonstration was supposed to unfold. This was not how a Grandmaster entertained a crowd. This was something else entirely, something that demanded respect he had not planned to give. The clock ticked again, sharper now, louder in the silence. Victor leaned in closer, studying the position with an intensity that bordered on disbelief. The pieces were not lost, not yet, but they were constrained, boxed into lines that offered no clean escape. Every move seemed to invite another response that tightened the structure further. And that was when he saw it, not fully, not clearly, but enough to feel its weight, a pattern, a path, something forming several moves ahead, something that pointed toward a position he did not want to reach. His hand withdrew slightly from the board, resting against the edge of the table as he recalculated again, deeper this time, pushing further into the possibilities, searching for a break, a disruption, a moment where the balance could shift back in his favor. But each variation circled back to the same quiet conclusion: limitation, control, inevitability. Across from him, Emily remained unchanged, her expression steady, her breathing even, her focus absolute, as if the outcome was already written somewhere beyond the board, and she was simply moving toward it one step at a time. The room had gone completely still now, not out of politeness, but because no one wanted to break the moment, because something rare was happening. Something that did not rely on spectacle or noise, but on precision, restraint, and quiet dominance. Victor finally made his move, slower than any before, placing his piece with care, but without conviction, and as his fingers released it, he knew. Not fully, not completely, but enough to feel the shift settle into place. The game was no longer his to control, and for the first time in years, Victor Hale was not certain he could find a way back. The silence had changed now. No longer filled with anticipation or quiet amusement, but with something heavier, something closer to disbelief. Victor Hale stared at the board, unmoving, his eyes tracing the position again and again as if repetition alone might reveal a path he had missed. But the more he looked, the clearer it became, not in a sudden realization, but in a slow, undeniable certainty that settled deep within him. He was no longer building toward victory. He was walking through a structure that had already been designed. Every piece he had moved, every line he had chosen, it all led here, and here was not where he wanted to be. The clock ticked again, sharp, almost intrusive, pulling him back to the present. His hand lifted slightly, hovering above his queen, then his knight. Then, retreating again as his mind ran through variations faster than the seconds allowed. There was always something missing, always one move too late, one square already controlled, one option quietly removed before he even recognized it. Across from him, Emily Carter remained still, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, her posture unchanged, her eyes calm, not watching him, not watching the crowd, only the board, as if everything else had faded away, and in that stillness, there was no pressure, no urgency, just quiet certainty. Victor leaned back slightly, a small movement, but enough for those watching to notice, because it was not part of his usual rhythm. He was not pressing forward, he was not asserting control, he was searching, and the room felt it. The shift had reached its peak. No one whispered now, no one moved. Even those who did not understand the depth of the position could sense the weight of the moment. Because the man who had dominated every match was now paused, caught in a space where dominance no longer applied. Victor leaned forward again, closer this time, his gaze narrowing as he focused on a single line, a sequence that seemed to offer possibility. He reached out, his fingers touching the piece, committing, but as he began to move it, something stopped him, not physically, but mentally. The line collapsed in his mind before it could form on the board, leading to the same conclusion. The same quiet end. His hand froze midair, suspended between intention and realization, and for a brief second, the entire room seemed to hold its breath with him. The clock continued to tick, but he did not move. He could not, because every path forward had already been accounted for. Every attempt to break free had been anticipated, and in that moment, the truth became undeniable, not just to him, but to everyone watching. He was trapped, not by force, not by aggression, but by precision, by patience, by a series of moves so subtle they had gone unnoticed until there was nothing left to notice. Victor slowly lowered his hand, not making a move, just resting it against the table, his expression no longer confident, no longer composed, but focused in a way that revealed everything he had tried to hide. The realization was complete now. The game had shifted beyond recovery, and he knew it. Across from him, Emily finally moved, her fingers gently guiding her piece into place, not rushed, not dramatic, just the next step in a sequence that had been unfolding long before anyone realized it. The sound of the piece touching the board was soft, almost insignificant, yet it echoed through the silence like a final note. Victor's eyes followed the move, and for the first time, he did not immediately respond. He did not calculate. He did not search. He simply looked, because there was nothing left to find. The position spoke for itself, clear, precise, undeniable, and in that quiet, suspended moment, Grandmaster Victor Hale, the man who had never hesitated, who had never doubted, who had never been outplayed in front of a crowd, sat completely still. The game no longer something he controlled, but something he had walked into, step by step, without ever seeing the end until it was already there. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling over the room like something tangible, something heavy enough that even the smallest sound felt out of place. Victor Hale remained still, his eyes locked on the board, not searching anymore, not calculating in the frantic way he had just moments ago, but absorbing, accepting, understanding the position in front of him for what it truly was. The ticking clock continued its steady rhythm, but now it no longer pressured him. It simply marked time as something irreversible unfolded. Across from him, Emily Carter did not move. She did not rush him, did not look up to claim victory or acknowledge the shift. She simply waited, her hands resting calmly, her presence steady, as if she had always known this moment would come and saw no reason to interrupt it. Victor exhaled slowly. A quiet breath that carried more weight than any word he had spoken that day. His fingers lifted again, hovering above the board, not with hesitation this time, but with clarity, because now he saw it fully, every line, every possibility. Every outcome converging into the same conclusion. There was no escape, no clever tactic, no hidden resource that would restore balance. The structure she had built was complete, precise, and unbreakable. He moved a piece at last, not as an attempt to win, but as an acknowledgement of the inevitable path ahead. The piece settled softly onto the square, and Emily responded immediately, her move flowing into place as if it had been waiting there all along. Not surprising, not dramatic, just correct, and that was what made it undeniable. The game continued for a few more moves, each one quieter than the last, each one stripping away the illusion that this had ever been anything other than what it was becoming, a demonstration not of dominance, but of understanding. The crowd did not react. There was no applause, no whispers, just stillness, because they were witnessing something that did not need commentary, something that spoke entirely through the board itself. Victor leaned back slightly again, his posture no longer tense, but composed in a different way now, not the arrogance he had carried before, but something more grounded, something closer to respect. His eyes lifted briefly from the board to Emily, studying her for a moment, not as an opponent to defeat, but as someone he had failed to recognize, and in that brief glance, there was no frustration, no anger, just quiet realization. He looked back down, his hand resting against the table. The clock ticking once more before he reached forward and made his final move, a small adjustment, a gesture that carried no strategy, only acknowledgement. Emily's response came without delay, her final piece sliding into place with the same calm precision that had defined every move before it, and then she stopped, her hand withdrawing, her eyes remaining on the board, not announcing anything, not needing to, because the position spoke clearly enough. Victor did not move. He did not reach for another piece. He did not search for alternatives, because there were none. The game had reached its conclusion, not through force, not through sudden collapse, but through a sequence so controlled, so deliberate, that by the time it was visible, it was already complete. The room held its silence, waiting for something, a reaction, a word, any sign that would break the tension, but none came immediately. Victor sat there, looking at the board one last time, then slowly, deliberately, he withdrew his hand and leaned back, the gesture subtle, but unmistakable. It was over. No declaration was needed, no explanation required. The outcome was understood by everyone present. Emily finally lifted her eyes, meeting his gaze once more, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, but with the same calm neutrality she had carried from the beginning, and in that quiet exchange, something shifted beyond the board itself, something that could not be measured in moves or positions. Victor gave a small nod. Almost imperceptible, but enough, because it was the first honest gesture he had made since the game began. The room remained silent, not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition, because what had just happened was not simply a game played and lost. It was a moment that revealed something deeper, something that lingered long after the pieces stopped moving, and as the clock continued to tick, indifferent to what had just unfolded, the lesson settled quietly into the space they all shared. Undeniable, unforgettable, and impossible to ignore for a moment. No one moved, no one spoke, as if the room itself needed time to process what had just unfolded. The polished boards, the quiet spectators, the ticking clocks all remained the same. Yet everything felt different now. Victor Hale slowly straightened in his chair, his posture no longer carrying the effortless authority that had defined him earlier, but something quieter, something more deliberate. His eyes lingered on the board one last time, tracing the final position not as a defeated player searching for errors, but as a master recognizing a structure of undeniable precision. Every move she had made now revealed its purpose, every choice aligned into something complete. Something that could not be dismissed or explained away. Across from him, Emily Carter gently withdrew her hands from the table, folding them loosely in her lap, her expression unchanged, calm, composed, untouched by the weight of what had just happened. She did not look around to gauge reactions, did not seek acknowledgement. She simply existed within the silence, as if the outcome had always been inevitable. A faint shuffle broke the stillness as someone near the back adjusted their stance. But even that small movement felt out of place, because no one wanted to be the first to disrupt the moment. Victor finally lifted his gaze from the board, his eyes meeting Emily's again, and this time there was no trace of condescension, no hint of dismissal, only a quiet clarity, the kind that comes when assumptions are stripped away completely. "You knew," he said softly, not as a question, but as a realization. Emily held his gaze for a brief second. Before responding, her voice steady, almost reflective. "I understood the position." Her answer was simple, but it carried a depth that echoed far beyond the board. Victor gave a faint nod, accepting it without argument, because there was nothing to challenge, nothing to defend. The truth had already settled into place. He shifted slightly in his seat, the subtle sound of fabric against wood drawing a few more eyes toward them. The audience, once entertained by the promise of a quick spectacle, now watched with a different kind of attention, one built on respect rather than expectation. A few seasoned players exchanged glances, not of surprise anymore, but recognition, because they understood what it meant to witness something like this. Something that did not rely on noise or dominance, but on quiet mastery. Victor placed his hand lightly on the edge of the board, not to move a piece, but to ground himself in the moment. His voice when he spoke again was calm, measured, stripped of any performance. "That was not luck," he said, almost to himself. Emily did not respond immediately, her eyes briefly returning to the board as if acknowledging the game one final time before she spoke. "Luck does not build patterns," she said, her tone even. Not defensive, not proud, simply stating what was already evident. The room absorbed her words in silence, because they carried a truth that did not need emphasis. Victor allowed a small, almost imperceptible breath to escape him, a release of something unspoken, something that had been present since the moment he invited her to play, and now, at last, it was gone, replaced by something else entirely. Understanding. He leaned back fully now, his posture relaxed in a way that was new. Not careless, not arrogant, but open, as if he had stepped out of the role he had been playing and into something more genuine. His eyes moved briefly across the room, taking in the faces that had once shared his certainty, now quiet, attentive, changed, and then he returned his focus to Emily, studying her not as an anomaly, but as a presence he had failed to recognize. "How long have you been playing?" he asked, not to test her, not to challenge, but to understand. Emily's lips curved ever so slightly, not quite a smile, but something close to it. "Long enough," she replied, and that was all, no elaboration, no need to explain a journey that spoke for itself through every move she had made. Victor nodded once more, accepting the answer for what it was, because he understood now that some things did not need to be detailed to be real. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer the silence of tension or disbelief. It was something steadier, something reflective, as if everyone present was holding on to the moment just a little longer, aware that what they had witnessed would not repeat itself in the same way again. And in that quiet space, the lesson settled deeper, not spoken, not declared, but felt, carried in the way Victor Hale sat differently, in the way Emily Carter remained unchanged, and in the way the room itself had shifted, forever marked by a game that had never been about winning or losing, but about revealing what had been there all along, hidden beneath assumptions. waiting patiently to be seen. The room did not return to normal, not immediately, because something had shifted too deeply to be undone by a simple end of game. Victor Hale remained seated for a moment longer than expected, his gaze drifting once more across the board, not out of habit, but reflection, as if he was replaying the sequence in his mind, not to challenge it, but to understand how something so quiet had carried so much weight. Emily Carter began to gather her things with the same calm presence she had shown from the beginning, her movements unhurried, her attention not drawn to the eyes that now followed her, because the room was watching her differently now, not as an outsider, not as an interruption, but as someone who had revealed something they had overlooked. A few spectators shifted slightly, exchanging glances that carried unspoken acknowledgement, some impressed, some unsettled, because it is not easy to witness certainty dissolve so completely, especially when it belonged to someone as established as Victor. One of the younger players near the side table leaned closer to another, whispering softly, but even that whisper felt restrained, as if the space itself demanded a certain level of respect. Now, Victor finally stood, the subtle sound of his chair moving against the polished floor drawing quiet attention, his posture straight, composed, but no longer defined by performance. He adjusted his jacket slightly, a small habitual gesture, then looked toward Emily again, who had just lifted her bag onto her shoulder, preparing to leave without ceremony, without announcement, without claiming anything from what had just happened. "Wait," Victor said, his voice calm but firm enough to carry, not commanding, but intentional. Emily paused, turning back toward him with the same steady expression, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. The room leaned into the moment again, not with tension, but curiosity, because this was not part of the expected script. Victor took a small step forward, closing the space just enough to speak without raising his voice. "You should be playing in the finals," he said, the words simple, but carrying weight far beyond their surface. A few heads turned sharply, the suggestion landing heavier than anyone anticipated, because it was not a compliment, it was recognition. Emily held his gaze for a second longer, considering, not the offer itself, but what it represented. Then she shook her head slightly, her voice calm, almost gentle. "That is not why I came." The answer was quiet, but it settled into the room with clarity. Victor studied her for a moment, not confused, but thoughtful, as if he was seeing a perspective he had not considered before. "Then why did you play?" he asked, not out of challenge, but genuine curiosity. Emily's expression softened just slightly, not into a smile, but into something reflective. "Because you asked," she said, nothing more, no elaboration, no hidden meaning, just a simple truth that carried its own weight. The room absorbed her words in silence, because they revealed something deeper than skill, something about intention, about presence, about the difference between proving something and simply being capable of it. Victor let out a quiet breath, nodding once as if the answer made perfect sense, because in that moment it did. He stepped back slightly, giving her space again, no longer trying to direct the moment, only acknowledging it. Emily adjusted the strap of her bag and turned toward the exit, her steps as measured and quiet as when she had first entered. But now every step carried a different meaning, not because she had changed, but because the room had. People moved subtly to make way for her, not out of obligation, but instinct, as if something within them recognized the need to create space. No applause followed her, no grand reaction, just silence, but it was not empty, it was full of recognition, of reflection, of something that lingered beyond the moment itself. Victor remained where he stood, watching her leave, not with regret, not with frustration, but with a quiet respect that had not been there before. And as the doors at the far end of the hall closed softly behind her, the room remained still for just a second longer, as if holding on to the presence that had just passed through it, before slowly, gradually, the sounds of movement returned, chairs shifting, quiet conversations beginning again. But nothing sounded quite the same, because something fundamental had shifted, not just in the game that had been played, but in the way it had been seen, and in the quiet aftermath of it all. One truth remained: steady and undeniable. The strongest move in that room had never been spoken. It had simply been understood.